So we're here in Manchester at a Women's Equality Party event against police corruption and sexism in policing, and I'm here with Veronica, and I know that you've got a story about the police, so I'm just going to go ahead and let her tell you about her experience.
Okay. It's long running. It goes back as far as 2014 when I first reported a man to the police for violence, and I realised what happens, and that is basically nothing. I was blamed and victimised for doing that, and eventually found that all my paperwork had been thrown away, all records of my reporting it to the police had been deleted. So that kind of began a long process of me doing legal battle against the police. I'm not a lawyer, I don't have a legal background, but I also couldn't afford the costs that were involved in hiring a law firm, couldn't get any pro bono free legal help, so I basically had to become a lawyer and defend myself.
So, sorry to interrupt, you found the funding and the money involved in legal representation to be a barrier for you having access to the courts?
Yeah, I mean, I was working, I had a really good job, I worked in university, but even then the costs were prohibitive, and it's the cost of taking the legal action, but it's the cost risk mainly. And my experience is the police will drive up the costs as much as they possibly can to silence you. They want you to just give up at some point and become exhausted.
Sorry to digress, but by cost risk, can you explain to the audience what that means? Because I don't know if they'll have a full understanding of just how high the cost can be in litigation.
A standard judicial review, which was what I was starting out with against Nottinghamshire Police, I read that it would cost about 30,000 as a standard, and that's with a legal team inputting and helping. It could go up as far as 70,000. So if there's any delays along the way, you have to have maybe interim hearings, make interim applications. Every application is about £300, £400 or £500. So if you have to appeal it, that's more cost. So it can actually go up as far as £70,000. I had a mortgage at the time, and I really was not in a place to run that risk. So that's why I basically represented myself.
So you had these issues with the police and your data. So I presume, if I'm correct, you started the proceedings in the High Court because your avenue of redress that you went down was judicial review, which has to be started in the High Court.
Yeah. So the judicial review was initially against a decision made by Nottinghamshire Police when I tried to make my second report of violence. And they basically stuck me with a caution for harassment because they said that my reporting this man to the police was my harassing him. And then they threw away all my statements and they told me there was no evidence of harassment, I didn't admit to it at any point, I have all the kind of interview tapes and everything. But they said I could not report him for a second occasion until I had signed a caution for harassment. Then they proceeded and recorded that on the police system even though I didn't accept it. So lots of rules and things were broken in that process. To get rid of that caution, I had to take a judicial review. So it was reviewing the police's decision to record a caution. 3 months before the actual hearing, the police removed the caution. It disappeared because they knew it wasn't legal to begin with. And they waited until it was down the wire, and I'd done all of the legal process up to the point almost before the hearing.
Did you incur any costs for that, and did you get them back?
I did. It cost about £1,500 in total to actually lodge the legal action. There was a lot of what people don't realise once you start legal action, there's a hell of a lot of paperwork involved. And this is back in 2017, it had to be paper-based copies, so there was like hundreds of pounds worth in photocopying, filing, paginating, so there's an awful lot of work that goes into that as well. I was awarded my costs back and I got about 100 hours of my time as a litigant in person. So as a litigant in person, you can charge £19 per hour for your time, whereas a lawyer or barrister will charge up to about £450. So if you do it yourself, the police were winning as well because I represented myself. I got all my costs back, but if I had have used a legal team, they would have had a hell of a lot of costs to pay at that point.
So you currently, well not currently, but then you had another judicial review, didn't you, against GMP?
Yeah.
And that went to the Court of Appeal, and now you're appealing the cost to the Supreme Court, aren't you?
Yeah. So this is in the process of challenging Nottinghamshire Police. I then experienced harassment from Greater Manchester Police. Nottinghamshire Police basically asked Greater Manchester Police to come and harass me before the first hearing back in August 2017. And since then, there's been a plethora of false recordings made against my name that are not evidenced, have never been investigated. I had no idea these things existed until late 2021, middle of last year. I asked Greater Manchester Police to erase that data because it's false and falsely recorded. They failed to do that, and they actually increased the severity of the recordings. So I'm now recorded for crimes that are one step down from murder of people I've never even met, and it's violent harassment with violence, which is like use of firearms. It's crazy, crazy stuff. They held back data from the original application for judicial review. Then they held back data from the High Court appeal in Manchester. They lied in the Court of Appeal in London, and they ran costs up to £13,000. So it's on appeal to Supreme Court at the moment, and that's mainly the cost order that I'm appealing of £13,000. I don't have the cash to pay that. I don't have the will to fight them anymore, but neither should I be held accountable for the costs, because these are basically false records recorded against me through police malice. So yeah, it's with the Supreme Court.
So as a litigant in person, how have you found the experience of not just going through the legal system, but obviously you've interacted with the highest courts in the land? Have you found that difficult? Have you found it stressful? Was it not as bad as you thought? What's been your general feeling on the experience so far?
I think when I started on the journey with Nottinghamshire Police, I was naive to the process, and I had the benefit of having quite nice judges at that point. And it was lower court judges, so they seemed to be a bit more amenable to litigants in person. It was stressful, and I think what I found worse about that was when I started to get data disclosures from the police, I saw exactly what they had recorded, the wrong that they had done, and how they had treated the man that I had reported. They treated him like a king in the face of all the evidence against what he had done. It was okay, it was doable. At this point, I am completely worn out. I am exhausted. I'm in bad health. I'm not working at the moment due to health reasons. I don't have the energy for battling police anymore. And the extreme end of the scale this year has been not realising that the higher courts actually publish judgments online on the National Archives. I have found my home address sitting on Google with the name of the man I originally reported to Nottinghamshire Police, who wasn't even part of this process, and that's because judges have just published my home address without even questioning if that was okay to do that. I had a long battle for about 2 months to get my address off the internet. I'm still battling with the Court of Appeal to have their judgment taken down. High Court of Manchester have agreed to take that judgment down owing to the distress that it's causing. I am no further forward. The false recordings are still sitting on Greater Manchester Police System. I don't have the will anymore to battle them. I may have to leave it at this point, but it's just been futile at this stage. It just feels futile.
So the final question I'll ask, because I've always had a bit of an issue with this actually, is how do you feel about the judgments being online? Because effectively what happens with the judgments is in the High Court, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, the judgments will be published. So what happens is there's a factual background which is a summary of the events that have led to the action in the first place, which effectively repeats the event. So for example, if you're judicial reviewing an arrest for harassment, all of the details of that harassment will then be put in the judgment, so you're effectively being exposed online. Personally, I understand there's constitutional reasons for this, but I don't see any reason to name a normal person instead of saying like Smith and Greater Manchester, Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police. They could just put X, but they won't do it. Personally, I find that off-putting, and I think it actually puts people off going to court. How do you feel about that?
It has definitely put me off appealing anything through the Court of Appeal. I put an anonymisation request into the Supreme Court, which is sat there at the moment for review. I did not realise that judgments in higher courts were published online, and this has been used against me by judges as well. They says, well, you knew this, and it's this assumption that as a litigant in person you know everything. I didn't. The court didn't tell me that this would be happening. So it was a shock when I saw my information sitting on the internet and the realisation anyone could freely use it. The biggest challenge is the National Archives are the people tasked with publishing judgments now, and that's been for the past 12 months. So this was a change in how judgments are published. From my experience, judgments are published under Open Justice licence, so there's criteria. It's not just a free-for-all. There's license agreement that you're essentially signing up to when you download anything. There's no actual download agreement that you make when you download those judgments as a member of the public or as a business. And the Open Justice licence is not being managed by the National Archive because they seem to have no way of managing it. It's like putting a 5-bar gate in the middle of an open ocean and saying that is a checkpoint everyone has to go through. Nobody even knows the 5-bar gate is there. So the National Archive, originally what was happening were companies on the other side of the world, or AI, crawling the National Archive judgments. They're republishing them and selling them on overseas to law students or law companies. And they're doing so without observance of the Open Justice Licence. When the National Archive was taking down judgments with my home address in it to have that anonymised, those companies overseas were not notified about that because the National Archive has no way of notifying anyone of takedowns and changes and anonymisations. So for 2 months after I found my home address and the judges took it out of the judgments, it was still showing on Google, and it was left to me to kind of battle with these companies overseas to get my address off the internet. So there is no reason for my name to be in the judgments. It changes nothing. They were appeals of judicial review applications. They weren't even judicial review outcomes. They're taking my name out changes nothing. But the judgments do contain a significant amount of police lies. So the police lies have filtered into the judgments. So now those lies and my name are now sitting on the internet. It horrifies me. It horrifies me. Anyone can find me. Anyone can see those lies. I can't refute those lies. People will just read them. So I've lost control over my own narrative. I've lost control over my own life. These will impact on everything for me for as long as I'm living, through to if I apply for jobs, if I have customers and clients in a business. So it just seems that in challenging the police corruption, I'm being punished for life. And those judgments published to me are nothing more than a punishment. It's like I said, it's a platform for witch burning, and that's really what it is. There is times when there is a need to publish people's names in judgments in criminal cases and criminal outcomes, but for civil matters, judicial reviews, there is absolutely no need for an individual's name, and especially not their address, ever to be published online. It's bonkers. It makes no sense.
Well, I was going to shake your hand, but good luck with the Supreme Court and good luck with your case in general. I know how exhausting litigation can be, and I think you're pretty tough and brave for going through all of those courts by yourself when you're not a lawyer. Well, it's a thin line, you could say.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you. Okay. Right.